At exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Day, my phone received 23 calls in less than 10 minutes. I know that precise number because I counted them later on my call log, but at the time I was simply sitting by a wide, frost-framed window in the Green Mountains of Vermont, holding a steaming mug of black coffee and watching fresh snow drift across a quiet, white hillside. The only sounds inside the small timber cabin were the rhythmic crackle of the stone fireplace and my golden retriever, Cooper, snoring softly on the woven rug beside my armchair. Then my phone lit up on the side table. One call, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession, followed by a torrent of group text notifications so relentless that the screen barely stopped vibrating. My ex-husband, my 21-year-old son, and my 18-year-old daughter were all trying to reach me at once, their names flashing across the dark glass like flares sent up from a sinking ship. The strange part was not that they were calling me in a state of sheer panic. The strange part was that I knew, down to the exact minute, when those frantic calls would start. Have you ever spent years carrying the emotional and financial weight of an entire family, only to realize you are the person they complain about the most? For 15 straight Christmases, I paid for every single holiday gathering my family demanded. The luxury mountain chalets, the gourmet catering, the endless lists of designer gifts, and all the hidden logistical extras nobody remembers until the final bill arrives. Yet somehow, in their narrative, I was always the problem, the mood killer, the mother who fell short. This Christmas, at 38 years old, I decided to stop playing my assigned role in their play. And at 6 that evening, reality finally caught up with them. My ex-husband, Richard Vance, and I divorced nearly 15 years ago when our children were still small. When the marriage fell apart under the weight of his endless grandiosity and financial carelessness, one unwritten tradition stubbornly refused to die: Christmas. When Brandon was 6 and Natalie was 3, I understood why keeping a shared holiday tradition mattered. I was a young mother trying to protect my children from the jagged edges of a broken home. I didn't want them bouncing between 2 bitter households or feeling forced to choose sides during the one time of year meant for warmth. So when Richard casually suggested renting a mountain cabin in Aspen for our first post-divorce Christmas, I agreed to fund it. That first year was actually peaceful. We cooked simple meals, the children built snowmen in the driveway, and for a few days, everyone acted like a functional family. But over time, as Richard realized I was quietly picking up every check to avoid conflict, the annual Aspen trip shifted from a quiet family retreat into a full-scale luxury production. And as the years rolled on, the expectations grew exponentially. What began as a modest holiday getaway turned into an obscene display of entitlement. The chalets got larger, the private catering got fancier, and the gift lists transformed from simple toys into endless spreadsheets of designer apparel, high-end electronics, and luxury accessories. Even Richard, who contributed precisely $0 to his own children's upbringing beyond court-mandated minimums, had loud, authoritative opinions about every detail. The cabin needed a better slope-side view. The holiday menu required organic, chef-curated options. The interior decorations had to look upscale enough for his social media posts. Every year there was another hidden expense waiting around the corner, and every single year I paid it. I didn't pay because I enjoyed spending $10,000 on a week-long flex. I paid because at 28, 32, 35, I honestly believed that keeping the peace was worth the sacrifice. But the most insidious part wasn't how much money I spent out of my business account. It was how little appreciation came with it. If the weather was too cold for skiing, I heard about it at the dinner table. If holiday traffic delayed someone's shuttle from the airport, I was somehow blamed for poor planning. If a high-end restaurant reservation wasn't executed flawlessly, Richard would shake his head and imply that my lack of sophistication was to blame. I could spend 3 months' salary creating the exact holiday they demanded, and within 2 hours of arrival, someone would find a reason to make me feel small. For years, I lied to myself. I told myself families just argue under stress. I told myself the kids would mature once they hit high school. I told myself next year would be different. But next year was never different. Eventually, in my mid-30s, running my own architectural design firm in Burlington, I noticed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Nobody ever asked how I was doing. Nobody asked whether I was tired after working 80-hour weeks to close client contracts before the holidays. Nobody asked whether I actually wanted to spend my rare time off in a crowded resort surrounded by artificial laughter. Nobody ever asked if I could easily afford an increasingly outrageous Christmas. They only wanted to know one thing. Was everything paid for? That realization hit me harder than any screaming argument ever could. Little by little, behind my quiet smile, I began to digest a painful, unvarnished truth. They weren't excited to see me. They were excited to see what I was paying for. I wasn't their mother or ex-wife enjoying a holiday. I was an uncredited, glorified ATM machine with a purse. For years, I thought I was buying family memories and protecting my children from the pain of divorce. What I was really doing was buying access to my own children, and even that access came packaged with constant criticism and disrespect. And that realization set the stage for the Christmas that changed everything. Last Christmas should have been the year everything finally worked out. Or at least that's what I told myself while approving invoice after invoice. The private chalet alone cost more than most families spend on a year's worth of mortgages, followed by 5-star catering and mountains of wrapped boxes under a commercial-grade tree. By Christmas morning, I had spent over $8,000. After dinner, my 21-year-old son, Brandon, opened the main gift I had spent weeks sourcing, a limited edition luxury watch he had explicitly requested. He stared at the box, smiled for perhaps 10 seconds, and then began pressing buttons and twisting the crown. Suddenly, his face darkened. "Mom, what's wrong with this thing? It stopped working." I offered gently that it was likely an automatic movement that needed winding, or a simple setting issue we could resolve with the jeweler after the holiday. Brandon reacted as if I had personally handed him trash. "You spent all this money and couldn't even make sure it worked properly?" The room went dead silent. Before I could answer, Richard chimed in smoothly. "Honestly, Evelyn, this is exactly what you always do. You cut corners somewhere." Natalie, then 17, rolled her eyes and added, "It's like you always find a way to ruin things, Mom." Standing there in that $8,000 room, watching my family unite in disdain against me over a mechanical watch setting, something inside me finally broke. Every dish, every gift, every log in the fireplace had been bought with my sweat. I looked at Brandon, at Richard, at Natalie, and I realized I was paying thousands of dollars for the privilege of being humiliated. While they returned to their wine, I sat alone on the downstairs sofa and asked myself a brand new question. What would happen if I simply stopped paying for their play? The answer was crystal clear. Next year, they would get exactly what they paid for. By the time October arrived, the memory of that humiliating Christmas night in Aspen had settled into a quiet, cold resolve. Then, right on schedule, the family group chat flickered back to life. Every autumn followed the exact same script. A few casual messages about holiday schedules, a handful of venue links, And before long, everyone was excitedly planning an extravagant Christmas trip they had zero intention of funding themselves. The first message came from Richard. He dropped a Zillow link to an 8,000 square foot luxury timber chalet in Aspen, featuring a heated indoor pool and panoramic slope views. 45 seconds later, he followed up. Looks perfect for this year's trip. Let's lock it in before availability drops. Not, what do you think, Evelyn? Not, can we afford this? Not even, are you interested in hosting again? Just a casual, arrogant assumption that my bank account was an open faucet waiting to fill his glass. Within 48 hours, Brandon began dropping his own links into the chat. Designer streetwear collections, high-end electronics, and luxury leather goods. Every message read less like a wish list and more like an invoice submitted to an accounts payable department. Natalie joined in shortly after, focusing entirely on the dining arrangements. She wanted to know if we could hire the same boutique catering company as last year, but requested that they add a private pastry chef and expand the organic dessert bar. The conversation rolled forward for 2 weeks, with 47 messages exchanged, yet not a single person raised the only question that actually mattered. Who was paying for any of it? Because in their minds, that question had been permanently answered 15 years ago. The old version of me, the insecure, peacekeeping 28-year-old, would have panicked, stressed over my business cash flow, and quietly absorbed the financial strain. This time, I refused to play the passive victim. On November 12th, I sat at my desk in my architectural firm, opened the group chat, and typed a clear, unambiguous statement. I have funded and hosted 15 consecutive Christmases for this family. This year, I am taking a break and spending the holidays quietly on my own. Anyone who wants to rent a chalet in Aspen or hire catering is welcome to organize and pay for it themselves. I hit send. I didn't use angry exclamation points, I didn't list past grievances, and I didn't leave room for negotiation. It was a firm, adult boundary delivered 6 weeks in advance. What happened next was a masterclass in generational denial. Richard replied 5 minutes later with a single laughing emoji, followed by, "Good one, Ev. Don't stress. We'll let you pick the wine menu this time." Brandon sent a thumb up sticker, and Natalie didn't reply at all. They didn't hear my boundary because they had spent 15 years training themselves to believe my voice only existed to deliver approval and funds. Sensing an opportunity to assert his dominance while banking on my eventual surrender, Richard took a calculated gamble. He used his personal credit card to place an $800 initial holding deposit on the Aspen Chalet, confident that I would quietly transfer the remaining multi-thousand-dollar balance to his account before the December deadline, just as I had done during our marriage whenever he overspent. Meanwhile, Natalie went ahead and submitted a formal booking request to the luxury catering company under my name, listing my firm's business email as the billing contact. They weren't just ignoring my boundary, they were actively trying to steamroll over it. 2 weeks before Christmas, the corporate notifications began arriving in my inbox. The Aspen rental agency sent a final balance demand for $7,200, warning that failure to settle the account by December 20th would result in automatic cancellation and forfeiture of the deposit. 48 hours later, the manager of the catering firm emailed asking for billing authorization for Natalie's $4,000 dinner order. I didn't ignore the catering email or let it linger in ambiguity. Operating with strict legal and professional clarity, I replied directly to the catering manager. Please be advised that I have not authorized this order, nor have I authorized anyone to use my name or corporate billing details. Kindly direct all invoices and correspondence to the individual who placed the request, Natalie Vance. The catering manager thanked me for the clarification and promptly canceled the unbacked reservation. As for the chalet rental, I simply read the reminder notices and closed the tab. No payments, no frantic phone calls, no counter-arguments. 3 days before the holiday, I packed my truck with warm flannel, a stack of novels, and 3 bags of groceries. I loaded my golden retriever, Cooper, into the passenger seat, locked the doors of my Burlington home, and drove south into the quiet, snow-draped hills of Vermont to my small rented cabin. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the pines, knowing with total clarity that at 6 p.m. the following evening, reality was scheduled to arrive. Christmas Day in the Green Mountains of Vermont broke with a soft, silvery light filtering through the frosted glass of my small timber cabin. Outside, 5 inches of powdery snow had fallen overnight, transforming the pine forest into a silent, shimmering sanctuary. Inside, the stone hearth crackled rhythmically as I sat curled up in my favorite flannel armchair, a steaming mug of hazelnut coffee resting between my hands, while Cooper slept peacefully on the braided rug at my feet. For the first time in 15 years, my Christmas morning was completely free from frantic production schedules, demanding caterers, and the suffocating anxiety of managing Richard's unrealistic expectations. I spent those quiet early hours reading a novel, taking Cooper for a long walk through the pristine woods, and listening to the wind whistle softly through the trees. Yet, beneath the serene rhythm of my solitary holiday, a mental clock was ticking quietly in the back of my mind. I knew the exact schedule of my family's annual Aspen trip down to the minute, and I knew that at precisely 6 o'clock that evening, 15 years of unearned entitlement were scheduled to collide head-on with reality. 3 states away, in the high-altitude luxury of Aspen, Colorado, Richard, Brandon, and Natalie were pulling into the snow-lined driveway of the 8,000-square-foot timber chalet at 5:45 p.m. They arrived in high spirits, their oversized SUV packed with mountain gear, designer luggage, and unshakable confidence. In their minds, the evening was guaranteed to unfold with the exact same effortless luxury they had taken for granted since childhood. Walking through heavy carved oak doors into a preheated entryway, pouring expensive wine while a hired chef prepped a gourmet 5-course feast in the commercial kitchen, and relaxing by a massive stone fireplace. At 5:58 p.m., Richard stepped onto the covered porch, brushed snow off his tailored coat, and pressed his fingers against the bronze digital lock pad on the front door. He entered the master access code issued to him weeks earlier when he had placed his $800 holding deposit. The keypad beeped 3 times, flashed a sharp red indicator light, and remained stubbornly locked. Richard frowned, muttered a sharp curse about cheap technology, and punched the numbers in a second time, pressing down on the glass display with aggressive emphasis. Once again, the lock buzzed red and refused to disengage. What Richard failed to grasp was the rigid, automated operational protocol of high-end property management firms in Aspen during peak holiday weeks. At precisely 6 o'clock p.m. on December 25th, the property management system executed its automated end-of-day audit. Because the remaining $7,200 balance had never been settled by the December 20th deadline, and because Richard's personal credit card was declined for the full amount due to his own maxed-out credit limits, the booking system automatically marked the reservation as canceled for non-payment. The software instantly revoked the temporary access code, securing all 8,000 square feet of heated marble, fireplaces, and slope views tighter than a bank vault, without requiring a single human employee to intervene. Standing on the exposed porch in sub-zero winds, surrounded by luggage and freezing air, the reality of their situation began to set in. Brandon marched around the perimeter, trying the side and back patio doors, but every single entry point was locked tight. Frustration quickly boiled over into chaotic panic. Natalie, shivering in her designer coat, pulled out her phone to call the boutique catering company, hoping to at least secure their Christmas dinner, while Richard sorted out what he assumed was a minor administrative mix-up. When the catering manager answered, his professional voice delivered the second devastating blow. "Miss Vance, as we noted in our official email 2 weeks ago, your reservation was canceled due to a lack of payment authorization from Mrs. Evelyn Miller. We have no staff or food assigned to your location tonight." There was no private chef waiting inside, no organic pastry bar, and no catered feast. There was only a dark, silent house, a frozen driveway, and 3 people who had never once considered what a holiday cost. At 6:15 p.m., the peace inside my Vermont cabin was punctuated by the vibration of my phone on the side table. I looked down to see my screen glowing with continuous notifications, 23 missed calls, text messages typed in all caps, and a string of frantic voicemails from Richard, Brandon, and Natalie. Richard's texts cycled rapidly from authoritative commands, "Call me immediately, there is a disaster with the house," to furious accusations that I had somehow sabotaged their holiday out of petty bitterness. Brandon texted that I was ruining their family tradition over a misunderstanding, while Natalie's messages sounded confused, frightened, and overwhelmed. For 15 years, my motherly reflex would have been to rush to my laptop, wire thousands of dollars, call local hotels, and rescue them from their own gross incompetence. But as I took a slow sip of coffee and listened to the fire crackle, I felt an extraordinary sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't ruining their Christmas. I was simply refusing to sponsor their irresponsibility any longer. I let the phone vibrate quietly across the table, allowing the silence to deliver the message for me. At 7:15 p.m., after letting my phone vibrate undisturbed on the side table for over an hour, I finally reached over and tapped the screen to answer Richard's 13th consecutive call. The moment the line connected, I put the call on speaker and set the phone back down beside my cooling coffee mug, keeping my hands resting calmly in my lap. Before I could even speak, Richard's voice exploded through the tiny speaker, distorted by the howling aspen wind and dripping with pure rage. "Evelyn, where on earth are you? What kind of sick game are you playing? We've been standing outside in 15-degree weather for over an hour. The access code for the chalet is completely dead. The rental company says the reservation was canceled for non-payment, and the catering crew never showed up." "What did you do?" From somewhere nearby, Brandon's voice cut in, loud and aggressive. "Mom, this is insane. Our bags are sitting in the snow, everyone is freezing, and we look like idiots. Fix this right now." Natalie's voice joined last, sounding smaller, caught between rising panic and pure exhaustion. "Mom, please, we don't have anywhere to go." "Can't you just call them and pay the balance?" I listened in complete silence until the chorus of demands, threats, and desperate pleas finally ran out of breath. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't get defensive, and I didn't let my heart rate spike. 15 years of managing high-stakes construction sites and running my own architectural firm had taught me that when panic meets authority, absolute stillness is the most powerful presence in the room. "Are you all finished?" I asked, my voice as steady and cold as a sheet of winter ice. A heavy, uncertain silence fell over the line, punctuated only by the crackle of static and the distant howl of the Colorado wind. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, I asked 2 precise, unyielding questions. "Richard, did you pay the remaining $7,200 balance on the chalet rental?" Silence. "Natalie, Brandon, did either of you pay the deposit for the catering company or authorize the invoice?" More silence, save for the sound of Richard clearing his throat nervously against the freezing air. Richard tried desperately to regain his footing, shifting instantly to his old, reliable weapon of social manipulation. That's completely beside the point, Evelyn. You know very well that Sandra and my country club friends know we come to Aspen every single year. You knew we were coming here. You've paid for Christmas every single year since the divorce, and you know how important this tradition is for the kids. I almost smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of pure, unadulterated clarity. That is precisely the point, Richard, I replied softly, ensuring my voice carried clearly to my son and daughter over the speaker. I sent a direct message to the family group chat on November 12th, 6 weeks ago, stating explicitly that I was taking a break, that I would not be funding or organizing Christmas this year, and that anyone who wanted to rent a chalet in Aspen was responsible for paying for it themselves. You chose to ignore my boundary. You chose to gamble on my compliance, and you chose to use your own card to place a deposit you couldn't back up. You can't just ruin Christmas for your own children because you're having an emotional episode, Richard barked, escalating to his final tactic of psychological guilt. But the old levers had lost their tension. The mechanism was broken for good. I didn't ruin Christmas, Richard, I said firmly, my tone leaving zero room for debate. I simply stopped financing your illusion of one. I spent 15 years paying over $10,000 a season to give you all a luxury holiday, only to be treated like an uncredited servant and blamed whenever a mechanical watch needed winding or the weather wasn't warm enough. I bought the food, I got the gifts, I paid for the roof over your heads, and in return, you made me feel unwanted at my own table. You didn't come to Aspen to see me. You came to consume what I paid for. Natalie sniffled on the other end, the harsh reality finally puncturing her lifelong bubble of entitlement. Mom, we're standing in a dark parking lot. It's freezing. My heart twinged with a mother's natural instinct to protect, but I knew that stepping in now would undo every ounce of self-respect I had just reclaimed for myself and my daughter's future. Natalie, you are an 18-year-old adult. Brandon is 21, and your father is 45, I said gently, but with absolute, unshakable finality. You have credit cards, you have phones, and there are dozens of hotels in the valley. You can book a room, order a pizza, and pay for it yourselves. The chair at my table in Vermont was wide open, but none of you ever asked where I was going or if I was okay. I am officially retired from being this family's ATM machine. Merry Christmas. I tapped the red button, ended the call, and turned off my phone completely, allowing the deep, unbroken quiet of the Vermont forest to wrap around me like a warm blanket. The morning after Christmas arrived in the Green Mountains of Vermont with a brilliant, cold blue sky that reflected off the fresh snowfall like crushed diamonds. I woke up at 7 o'clock, stretched lazily under the thick duvet, and felt an unfamiliar, deep sense of tranquility washing over my chest. I made a fresh pot of hazelnut coffee, filled a bowl with warm oatmeal, and sat at the sunny kitchen island while Cooper rested his heavy golden head on my knee, content simply to be near me. For the first time in 15 years, my morning after felt completely clean and unburdened. There were no mountains of ripped, expensive wrapping paper scattered across a giant living room floor for me to clean up. No delicate fine china to hand wash after an unappreciative crowd. And no lingering, toxic tension hanging over the breakfast table like a dark storm cloud. When I finally decided to turn my phone back on around 10 o'clock, a massive wave of missed notifications and text messages flooded the screen. But their power to disturb my inner peace had completely vanished. Richard had sent 3 lengthy, furious emails threatening legal action for what he dramatically called emotional distress and breach of implied contract, an absurd claim that my close friend who works as an attorney in Burlington later laughed at heartily over lunch. Brandon had posted a passive-aggressive Instagram story featuring a dark, grainy photo of their cramped, overpriced motel room on the highway outskirts of Aspen, captioned with the words, "When family turns their back on you on Christmas." Yet, as I scrolled through these desperate attempts to drag me back into their familiar cycle of guilt and shame, I felt no anger or urge to defend myself. I simply closed the apps, set the phone face down on the wooden counter, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my hot coffee. For years, I had allowed their emotional reactions to dictate my internal weather, running myself ragged to prevent their dissatisfaction. Sitting in that quiet Vermont cabin, watching the sunlight play across the snow-covered pine branches outside, I finally realized that their anger was not a measure of my failure as a mother, but merely the natural friction of entitled people realizing that the gravy train had come to a permanent halt. Predictably, back in our social circles in Michigan and among extended relatives, Richard tried to mobilize a full-scale public shame campaign against me to salvage his fragile ego. He called anyone who would listen, from his golfing buddies at the local country club to my distant cousins, telling them a completely fabricated narrative about how his ex-wife had suffered an irrational mental breakdown and heartlessly abandoned her own children in the freezing snow on Christmas night out of pure, bitter spite. He spun elaborate tales of how he had heroically stepped in to shelter the children, attempting to paint himself as the long-suffering, protective father dealing with an unhinged former spouse. But his carefully constructed illusion quickly fell apart under the weight of basic facts and simple logic. When my cousin Beth saw Brandon's dramatic social media post, she didn't join in the public outrage against me. Instead, she posted a direct, unfiltered public reply that read, "Your mother funded 15 consecutive luxury vacations for you without a single thank you. She gave all of you 6 weeks advance written notice that she was taking a break this year. You are 21 years old, Brandon. Pay for your own hotel room." Within a matter of hours, the wave of public sympathy Richard had desperately tried to cultivate completely evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable, ringing silence from his peers. Many of his country club acquaintances suddenly realized that the wealthy, generous lifestyle Richard had flexed for over a decade had been entirely subsidized by his hard-working ex-wife, exposing his grandiosity for the hollow sham it had always been. Friends who had previously listened to his complaints began quietly distancing themselves, realizing that a 45-year-old man complaining that his ex-wife refused to pay for his luxury vacation was not a victim, but a leech who had finally been detached from his host. By the end of December, the initial explosion of anger had burned itself out, replaced by a cold, uncomfortable reality that my family was forced to navigate without my financial safety net. Richard was forced to drain over $2,000 out of his own severely depleted savings account to cover 3 nights in a bleak roadside motel and pay for expensive, last-minute fast food meals for the family. A sharp financial sting that wounded his pride far more than any verbal argument ever could. For a man who defined his entire self-worth by the illusion of luxury and status, standing in line at a highway diner on Christmas Day while paying with his own maxed-out debit card was an excruciating dose of reality. Brandon returned to his university campus in January without his requested $3,000 luxury streetwear haul, forced, for the first time in his adult life, to wear the clothes he had purchased with his own summer job earnings and face his peers without an artificial veil of unearned wealth. For 15 long years, I had mistakenly believed that my job as a mother was to shield my children from every discomfort, hardship, and reality of their father's financial irresponsibility. I had thought that by paying every bill and smoothing over every conflict, I was showing them unconditional love and protecting them from the trauma of our divorce. But by finally stepping out of the way and refusing to be their financial cushion, I realized I hadn't destroyed our family dynamic. I had simply allowed reality to step in and deliver the vital life lessons I should have let them learn years ago. Enabling their entitlement hadn't made them love me more. It had merely taught them to value the wallet over the woman who held it. 3 weeks after New Year's Day, on a quiet, rainy Tuesday evening in mid-January, my phone rang while I was sitting at my drafting table in my Burlington office, working on a new architectural design for a residential client. I looked at the caller ID and saw Natalie's name flashing on the screen. My chest tightened slightly with a natural, maternal reflex of caution before I took a deep breath, composed myself, and pressed the green button to answer. I fully expected to hear another defensive lecture, a guilt-ridden demand for an apology, or a cold request for money to cover her upcoming college textbook fees and sorority dues. Instead, when the line connected, there was a long, hesitant silence on the other end, filled only by the faint sound of her breathing and the distant pitter-patter of rain against my office window, before my 18-year-old daughter spoke in a soft, subdued, and unusually fragile voice. "Hi, Mom." I kept my tone calm, warm, but firmly grounded. "Hi, Nat. How are your classes going?" She cleared her throat softly, hesitated again as if struggling to find the right words, and then asked a question that no one in my family had asked me in nearly 15 years. "Mom, how are you doing? Is your shoulder still aching from working long hours at the firm?" I sat back in my office chair, completely stunned into absolute silence, my breath catching in my throat as the sheer weight of those simple, empathetic words sank deep into my heart. For 15 years, my interactions with my children had been entirely transactional, centered around what they needed, what I owed them, or what bill was due next. To hear my youngest child inquire about my physical health and well-being was a seismic shift that shook me to my core. Natalie spent the next 45 minutes talking to me on that rainy Tuesday night, and for the very first time in her life, she spoke to me not as a demanding child addressing a domestic provider, but as one adult woman attempting to connect with another. She confessed that standing in that freezing, dark Aspen parking lot on Christmas night had been deeply humiliating and terrifying. But after the initial wave of shock and anger wore off, she had spent the remainder of the holiday reflecting deeply on everything I had said during that intense conference call. She admitted that her father had spent years quietly whispering in her and Brandon's ears that I was cold, distant, and obsessed with work, using that toxic narrative to justify why they should demand expensive gifts and vacations from me as compensation for my supposed emotional absence. I realized that night, standing in the snow, that you weren't cold at all, Mom, Natalie said, her voice trembling with genuine emotion as tears welled in her eyes and spilled over. "You were working 80 hours a week at the firm, so we could have everything we ever wanted, and we never even said a real thank you. We just took it and asked for more." Hearing my 18-year-old daughter articulate that profound truth didn't just validate the boundary I had drawn 6 weeks earlier, it officially marked the beginning of a deep, long overdue healing process between a mother and her daughter, grounded finally in truth, respect, and mutual understanding. As I listened to her break down those years of social conditioning, I realized that my refusal to pay for Aspen hadn't pushed my daughter away. It had finally freed her from her father's toxic web of entitlement and open the door for a real, authentic relationship between us. The vibrant autumn leaves had given way to the first gentle snowfalls of late November. But inside my Burlington home, the atmosphere was warmer and more serene than it had been in over 15 years. The shift hadn't happened overnight through a dramatic Hollywood-style reconciliation. It had taken root through months of small, deliberate steps, honest conversations, and unshakable boundaries. Richard had quietly drifted to the absolute periphery of our daily lives, completely unable to maintain a relationship with anyone he couldn't manipulate or financially exploit. Without my bank account to subsidize his extravagant grandiosity, his social standing had noticeably shrunk, forcing him to face the hollow reality of his own choices. Brandon remained somewhat distant, still nursing his wounded pride, struggling with his own adult responsibilities, and clinging to his father's defensive narratives. However, I allowed him the space and time to grow up at his own pace, without forcing expectations on him. I no longer spent my valuable emotional energy trying to rescue grown adults from the natural consequences of their behavior. Instead, I poured my heart, time, and attention into the connections that were grounded in mutual respect, genuine affection, and honest effort. The most profound and heartwarming transformation blossomed in my relationship with Natalie over the course of her freshman year of college. Taking my advice to heart after that eye-opening night in Aspen, she took on a part-time job at a local campus bakery to earn her own spending money, a small, practical step that fundamentally changed her entire perspective on labor, financial independence, and personal responsibility. When she visited me in Burlington during her Thanksgiving break, she didn't arrive with a spreadsheet of expensive requests, a list of designer clothes, or a demand for reservations at high-end restaurants. Instead, she walked through the front door with a brown paper bag of fresh Honeycrisp apples from a local orchard, tied a flour-dusted apron around her waist, and excitedly asked if we could bake an apple pie together, using my mother's old handwritten recipe. As we stood side by side at my marble kitchen counter, rolling out buttery pie crust, mixing cinnamon, and dusting flour across the counter, I looked at my 18-year-old daughter and felt a deep, quiet wave of peace wash over me. The invisible apron of servitude I had worn for 15 years had finally been laid down for good. We were no longer operating as a reluctant provider and a demanding consumer. We were two adult women sharing a home, a kitchen, a tradition, and an authentic bond built on mutual respect and affection. As December approached, bringing with it the familiar hum of the upcoming holiday season, Natalie approached me with a tentative, hopeful proposal as we sat over dinner one evening in my warm kitchen. "Mom," she said softly, leaning across the table and looking directly into my eyes, "for Christmas this year, can we just stay right here in Vermont? Just you, me, Cooper, and maybe a simple home-cooked dinner by the fireplace. No Aspen, no luxury chalets, no private catering, and no artificial drama." Tears of quiet relief welled in my eyes as I smiled and nodded in agreement, feeling a heavy weight lift from my spirit. On Christmas Eve, Natalie and I worked together in the kitchen to prepare a simple, delicious meal of herb-roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and roasted winter vegetables. There were no $7,000 chalet rental fees looming over my head, no tense arguments about missing luxury watch settings, and no performative social media posts intended to impress strangers. The dining table was set simply for two, framed by the warm glow of a modest evergreen tree we had cut down together at a local farm, and the cabin was filled with the rich, comforting aromas of honest home cooking, while soft jazz played gently from the living room speakers. On Christmas morning, while fresh, powdery snow dusted the pine trees outside the window, Natalie handed me a small, neatly wrapped package she had purchased entirely with her own earnings from her campus bakery job. Inside was a beautifully crafted, hand-carved wind sign meant to hang above my kitchen pass, etched with the words, "Evelyn's Kitchen, where everyone belongs and everything is earned." Tears spilled over my cheeks as I wrapped my arms around my daughter, holding her tightly against my shoulder, while Cooper rested his heavy golden head across our feet by the glowing hearth. In that quiet, radiant moment, surrounded by authentic love and true peace, I realized that setting a boundary 6 weeks before Christmas hadn't destroyed my family at all. It had actually saved it from complete moral collapse. By refusing to let my love be quantified by the depth of my bank account, I had given my daughter the greatest gift a mother could ever offer: the understanding that human worth is never measured by what you can extract from others, but by the respect, gratitude, and care you bring to the table. Seeing her take pride in earning her own money and giving a gift from her heart was worth more than every luxury vacation I had ever funded. Looking back on that 6 o'clock bell in Aspen a year ago, I no longer view it as a moment of conflict, retaliation, or bitter revenge. It was simply the exact moment I officially retired from being an unappreciated spectator in my own life and stepped fully into my authority as a self-respecting woman and mother. Generosity without boundaries is not love. It is enabling, and it eventually starves the giver until nothing remains but resentment, burnout, and exhaustion. True generosity requires self-respect, clear boundaries, and the courage to say a firm no when a yes comes at the direct expense of your peace, dignity, and soul. As the evening sun set over the snow-covered hills of Vermont, painting the winter sky in brilliant shades of rose, amber, and gold, I sat by the warm fireplace with my daughter and my dog, completely at peace with the world. I hadn't ruined Christmas by stepping back and refusing to pay for entitlement. I had finally built one that was real, lasting, and truly belonged to us,